in the building development process? Who is there who cares what it costs?
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas, and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now, here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello, and welcome to episode 73 of the show. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing? Everything on track and moving ahead? I'm well. Still stuck in stage 4 lockdowns in Melbourne. We're more than a month in now, with a few weeks still to go. It's actually been a bit of a roller coaster in terms of the emotions that you go through from day to day. Some days are fine, others are frustrating, and then there's everything else in between. But overall, I'm doing fine. Work has continued on my townhouse project, thankfully, with site cuts just about done and some retaining walls and new fence being installed along one boundary. We've had quite a bit of rain in Melbourne lately, so that has caused some delays and issues with boggy conditions. We're probably about 2 weeks behind schedule, I reckon, but I'm sure we can make that up as we go along. On my other project, it looks like we've had a good outcome with the council over the issue of the alignment of the new crossover. You may recall I mentioned that council wanted a long, windy crossover that was about 70 metres long, cutting across the front of the neighbouring block, and was, in my opinion, an unnecessary path when a fairly straight crossover would be a far safer and better outcome for the future residents. After 6 months of discussions, I've been advised that council will accept the shorter crossover alignment, which is a great result all round, I think. Don't forget, if you are interested in learning how to develop safely and profitably, then we have the mentoring program that's available to guide you through the developing process and teach you everything you need to know to become a successful property developer. We've had a couple of people get started in the past few weeks, so it's exciting to see people taking charge of their futures and investing in themselves. If you're interested in finding out more, then email me, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com, and I'll send you some information on the program. Okay, on to today's guest, former Victorian State Premier Ted Baillieu. I'm very excited to bring this conversation to you because I think it's quite a thought-provoking and fascinating discussion about the broader picture of property developing. Now, this is not a uniquely Victorian story. I think the topics we cover are relevant in most areas, and I'm sure they will be familiar to most property developers. Ted is a trained architect turned politician who was Premier of Victoria from 2010 to 2013. His family also has a long connection to the real estate industry across Victoria. While in opposition, Ted was, among other things, the Shadow Minister for Planning. So he understands the issues and challenges that relate to property developing, coupled with his professional training in architecture. So I think Ted brings a unique perspective to the table in terms of the wider social, political environment in which planning occurs, and then the practical aspects of understanding the developing process. He also has a unique insight into what it's like balancing the competing interests on all sides of planning and developing when you are the government of the day. During the conversation, we cover some very interesting ground, including why construction costs continue to rise, what's wrong with the planning process, and the ongoing importance of understanding your local market. Keep an ear out for Ted describing the slow decay of the planning process and the impact that has on the confidence that all parties have in the system. Now, the audio of this recording is not as great as I would like it to be, but stick with it as there is some real gold in this conversation. I kicked off the chat by asking Ted what food he would eat until he was sick, and it certainly surprised me.
That's easy. Rhubarb and custard on the wing at Geelong. I've long described that as the appropriate ending. Just prop me up on the wing at Geelong, watching the cats, and feed me rhubarb and custard until I'm expired.
Well, you wouldn't have been watching much of the cats out on the wing this year, and they're going all right though at the moment. My wife's a Cats fan.
Our seats are empty, but we're there in spirit.
Yeah, my wife's a Cats fan. Apparently, they're my second favourite team.
Most people's second favourite team. That's what gives it its strength. It's really the only regional team, and it gives it a sort of self-deprecating, warm, fuzzy feeling.
Yeah, what's your connection to the Cats, actually? How do you end up following Geelong?
Well, my great-grandfather, and he first arrived in 1853 and jumped ship as a miscreant and set up in Queenscliff and married a nurse who was on the ship behind. And between them, they had 14 children who survived, and they lived in a cottage on the beach at Queenscliff. So the Bellarine Peninsula is steeped in family history, and on my mother's side, there's the Camperdown history, so Western District history, Bellarine history, and frankly, my father would have beaten me up if I didn't go for Geelong. So I used to go to football with him as a kid. Every game down there.
Yeah, well, your family has a connection to real estate and property across Victoria, but you also have a background in that you're a trained, and I think you practiced as an architect for a little while.
I think I graduated in 76 or 77, and then I worked for McGlashan and Everest Architects in Melbourne. And in the 80s, set up with a university friend, John Main, and we were Main and Baillieu Architects for, I don't know, 25 years, 30 years or something. One guy's did a lot of education work, and other guys, and also some urban design work, and another guy some office work and residential work.
So you practiced for a pretty substantial period of time then?
Yeah. I should be able to remember the date when we dissolved our partnership, but nationally around 2002, 2003, something like that.
Okay, so along with being a practicing architect, you also were involved in politics, and you became the highest level bureaucrat or politician in the state, but you were also at one point the opposition spokesperson on planning. So I think you bring an interesting perspective to the conversation in that you have that practitioner perspective in terms of design and an understanding of building and developing, but then you also cross over and you bring that political perspective in terms of trying to balance competing views and understanding a system. Before we get to that, how did you get involved in politics?
Well, I had, I've often said that architects are really well trained for a political career, but very few go into political careers. I guess in my broader family, there's been political involvement in many ways going back some generations. My great-grandfather was William Knox. My mother's side was the first member for Kooyong, and there have been various other members of my broader family that have been involved in politics. So I had something of an interest, but as an architect, I saw no ticket, no start on building sites. I didn't like that. That got me involved. I saw the education system as important. I was doing a lot of education projects, and we were doing strategic planning, project planning out 20, 25 years for some school. And I could see the need for change there, and I was also pretty interested in the future of the Franklin River at the time, in the early 80s. So that actually led me to join the Liberal Party, and sort of friends and I got together and we started talking about how we could improve the party, and one thing led to another. I became president of the Liberal, vice president and president of the Liberal Party for 5 years, president through 4 elections, and then left, and in 1999 joined the state parliament. Yes,
and then just before we get to that, you mentioned that architects are well positioned to move into politics. Why is that?
I think they've got a good sense of the future and a good sense of realising change, and a good sense of social perception, which is important, and a good capacity to engage with bureaucracy, if you think about it, because those who come to power find themselves in those situations all the time. And if you can, it's as simple as, can you read a drawing? Do you know what you're looking at? What does the specification mean? What's the significance of it? How do you communicate? How do you draft submissions? What's important? What's going to make a difference? What are things going to look like in 10 years' time, but 40, 50 years' time as well? They're all fundamental attributes which lend themselves to civics. Many architects find themselves in local government, not so many go into state government, and I'd be struggling to name those who've had a crack at federal government. So there have been a few in Victoria. Myself, Justin Madden, who became the planning minister, probably didn't expect to be, but he went in there and suddenly he was the planning minister. Andrew McCutcheon, who was an architect on the Labor side, he actually became Attorney General, so that was a bit of a shift for him. There have been a few, but not so many. I think I'm the only architect who's become Premier. And I was pretty enthusiastic about that combination, and I had some fairly grand plans for elevating the profession as well when we got there. We'd probably get the time I would have liked to have seen some of that through, but there were certainly some important steps we took in that regard.
Yeah, so back to you entering into state parliament, then you became, I think, the opposition spokesperson, amongst other things, on planning. So I was curious around the issues that you saw at the time that you felt really needed to be addressed in the planning system.
Well, initially I'd become the Shadow Minister for tertiary education, which was a useful exercise as well. I did that for a while, and also then for gaming. But I became Shadow Minister for planning, and obviously I had some knowledge and understanding which assisted, and I got into that fairly heavily. I did a lot of writing for a lot of journals. I challenged some of the norms. And I was concerned then about the planning system. I was concerned about the waste, the duplication, the role of VCAT in particular, and the distance from the system had from ordinary people and the problems it caused for professionals. And generally, the planning system, I think, isn't what it should be. And we did propose some solutions which we were on the cusp of implementing, but when I left, some of those fell over, which I'm still dismayed about. But I can say one of those things was giving greater security and independence to the government architect and supporting that wholeheartedly. We did get on with that. Better resourcing, better independence, better surety. And again, after I left, that fell away to some degree, and I'm very disappointed about that.
Yes, well, we'll have a chat about the planning system. What did you think? Are there aspects of the planning system that you think work well back then and now?
Oh, well, the system itself is laid out pretty well these days. I mean, you can sit at home and with a click of a button, you can get to the bottom of any situation within 5 minutes if you know where to look. It's all there, so that part of it is good. There is much greater consistency with the schemes. I think most of the problems occur around those who seek to avoid the system. And ironically, in the early 90s, in the early 2000s, Labor had come to government in 99, introduced Melbourne 2030, and it had a lot of good intentions, but they're also the intentions of those who had done strategic plans in various forms for some time and seen those plans fail. And I don't think Melbourne 2030 overcame some of those problems. And the government itself became probably the principal recalcitrant when it didn't even follow its own strategic planning scheme. So when you get that situation going on and you've got VCAT seeming to constantly create a distance between local communities and outcomes, then you get a lack of confidence in the system. And that lends itself just to decay and dispute and disappointment. And I don't think we've advanced as much as we could have in that sense. And certainly, I had set out what I believe and still believe would be a better way of handling that, but we didn't get to implement it.
Yes, decay, dispute, and disappointment. That can be a fair way to sum up the planning system still, I'd have to say.
one of the words I find most interesting is the word entropy, and the planning system is certainly a cause of a fair degree of entropy in building development construction.
Yeah, well, there's still the chaotic sense still abounds, Ted, I have to say.
Well, I should make a fundamental observation, which I spent a lot of time talking about in opposition and in government, and I still believe is the case, that planners in the planning system have less influence on the outcome than the very high and steadily increasing cost of construction in this country. And our outcomes are dictated more by the high cost of construction than they are by any planners or any planning schemes. And one is cover for the other, sadly.
Yeah, I've read, I think you wrote delivered a speech or a paper about the high cost of doing inner city development, say for a high-rise versus a outer suburban greenfield development where the costs of building a big house are certainly much lower, but then you have the infrastructure issues related to having to live out there, which ends up being actually really quite costly.
Well, it's a challenge, and you need to look at the outcomes as if you're in the shoes of a young family, because that's what we're fundamentally there to do, to provide accommodation for families, to provide accommodation for the future, and to ensure that all the infrastructure and the social needs are available. But if you're a young family with a couple of kids either on the way or you have them already, and you're looking to make a choice, at the moment you've got a choice. You can choose a high-density apartment, 3 bedrooms, say, and you might be required to outlay 800, 900, 950,000 to achieve that. And it might be, if you're lucky, 70, 80, 90 square metres. But on the other hand, the choice that family has, they can go to a greenfield site and purchase a package and get themselves a 3-bedroom home, which might be 160, 170, even 180 square metres. And it might be $450,000, $500,000, $550,000. That's twice the size, half the price. So if you're a young family, what choice have you got? And families make that choice, and they go to greenfield sites. And in turn, developers make the same choice. They build 1 and 2 bedroom apartment blocks, and they might be in a 100 apartment development. In the inner city, high density, might be high rise, and it'll advertise as 1, 2 and 3 bedrooms. But if you look at the apartment schedule, there might be 2 or 3 3-bedroom apartments in that building, and they'll be very high priced, out of the reach of most families, and the rest is 1 and 2 bedrooms. And the second bedroom in the 2 bedrooms, if it's not inboard, it's going to be tiny. It's enough to put a suitcase or a cat. The facilities aren't there that should be there. We don't have cross ventilation. We don't have great air conditioning systems, and the apartments are small. And we've seen through the pandemic that none of that construction has lent itself to healthy occupation. So I've made the point for years that we are, forgive the language, I don't mean to be disparaging, we build far too much crap. And what we've done is put together developments which I describe as the crap trap, because they just don't present as family friendly. So families are making decisions to go elsewhere, and in a metropolitan developments, whether they're on transport routes or transport nodes, they're high density, but they're not family friendly, and we are creating this family donut in our cities. And it's not just in Melbourne, it's true elsewhere, because most of our planning schemes now are based on this premise that there is an even playing field in construction, and it's you get to make an equal choice, but it's not equal. high cost of construction mitigates against families, and no one wants to do anything about it because everybody's got a vested interest. Basically, the higher the cost of construction, the more money people make. And it's true in too much of our development, and it's also true in our infrastructure. And no one's looking after the families, no one's looking after the payers. And I think there are ways through it, but at the moment, this has been going for 15 or 20 years at least like this, and we're not getting better developments. As I say, we're building too much crap, and I happen in recent years to be chairing Victoria's cladding task force, and we've seen through that process that not only have we got cladding defective buildings, but we've got defects in high-rise buildings right across this country in areas that shouldn't be the case, whether it's plumbing, glazing, all sorts of systems. We've got the most expensive buildings, amongst the most expensive buildings in the world, but we don't have the best buildings in the world. And that's a problem which is forcing families to go where they don't really want to go, but where their financial choices mean they have to go.
Yeah, and one of the other challenges that I've found, and very common, is the amount of time it takes to get through planning and then delivering something to market. I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day that just to bring a 4-unit townhouse site, for example, in a suburban Melbourne location, takes around 2 years to be able to deliver that to market. You're lucky if you can get planning in 6 to 9 months, more like 12. Then you've got to get your building permit and documentation. There's another couple of months, then 10 months to build, a couple more months to get your occupational certificate and titles, and then before you know it, 2 years. And that's just to bring 4 townhouses to market.
Yeah, and that's ridiculous. But that's a product of the system not attracting trust and confidence. And if you haven't got trust and confidence and surety, then people will challenge it at every opportunity. And trust and confidence comes from performance. And I'm very pro-development. I'm an architect, I'm pro-development, but I see it in my local area. I see some terrible, terrible stuff being put to market. And I've made my efforts to have that turned around, and have almost invariably been unsuccessful. And I could walk you through particular examples, and that's all pretty boring, but some shocking proposals. And it shouldn't be that way. If the system is working well, people will have confidence in it. And if you can give people a fair choice, then families will be accommodated reasonably. But that's not what's happening. So the sclerosis in the system gets worse. The outcomes don't get better. People lose more and more trust and confidence. That's the pity of it all, because everybody suffers in that respect.
And so at what point do you think the performance doesn't match up to the expectation?
Well, you'd like to think that if there's a planning scheme, it'll have some currency and people stick to it and it's clear. And in certainly metropolitan Melbourne, most councils were required after Melbourne 2030 to also have not only Melbourne 2030, which was a global exercise, but they're also required to have a municipal strategic statement, which actually spells out the local forces, and to try and avoid the two forces coming into conflict. The MSSs, the municipal strategic statements, were constructed, but they were observed in the country in most cases, and that was the source of frustration. And it's just too easy to put together a program in a project in an area where you'd expect there to be a fairly significant balance of family apartments, family townhouses, and turn it into all one-bedders and two-bedders, and families disappear. And that's where the disappointment comes, because, and in many ways, I don't blame the developers. They do what they think they can sell easiest and quickest. And I've had this discussion with many developers, including in my local area when I was a member. So tell me, why are you doing this? Why are you 1 and 2 bedroom only? This is a family area, and here you've got a perfect site and you can do some terrific apartments. And they say, well, we benchmark. We benchmark against other developments. I said, well, that's the lowest common denominator, leading. Well, what about lifting your sites? No, they all want to benchmark. And they regard the marketing campaign as the difference. At the end of the day, we're jamming people into very small apartments with not great accommodation, not great facility. And we're creating social problems which will emerge in time. And I think that's incredibly disappointing because it doesn't have to be that way. If we gave greater weight to the NSS and less weight to there's sometimes strange views of VCAT or something, then there would be more certainty. And more certainty, then those decision makers would rise or fall on what their planning proposals were. But that's not what the case is now. No one's responsible for anything under a planning scheme. Councils aren't responsible because it's taken off them. VCAT's not responsible because they refer to the scheme. The minister's not responsible because there's a scheme. No one's actually responsible. And that's to everybody's detriment, in my view.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was saying this the other day with a colleague of mine. The councils basically have no responsibility. Some of their decisions make no sense. Some of them aren't even based in the planning scheme. But there's no accountability.
Even if they do that, their decisions are taken out of hand by VCAT. And let's face it, many developers will say, well, I'll put in a proposal to get myself to VCAT as fast as possible. And that's understandable from a developer's point of view, but it's not the way to build trust and confidence. And what we had initially proposed but didn't get to introduce was to say, well, that's all fine and good, but you don't get to go to VCAT unless you're substantially compliant with the municipal strategic statement. And that simply meant that if there's a left field decision, there's a left field proposal on the book, then that decision is taken at the local level, not taken at a remote level. And that would have then put responsibility in the hands of those who are answerable to their community. But VCAT's not answerable. At the end of the day, the minister's not answerable. The minister can call anything in, but he probably won't. Panels get promoted. Panels come up with their endorsement for this and that. It becomes so remote from local community that frustration becomes the norm. And sometimes good proposals get knocked off. Sometimes lousy proposals get approved. Either way, no one's happy.
If no one's happy, does that mean the system's working?
No, because it takes time, it costs money, and no one's responsible. You can't point a finger at it. I can walk down the street and I can show you, there's a really shocking development. Who was responsible for that? And you can't really say.
Is there a difference in perspective that you take into government, or once you get into government, than you do in opposition from a planning perspective?
Oh, no, and I was very mindful of that. And so what we took into government in planning policies, we had stood by it through 2 elections. And we got on with the government architect changes, and they were welcomed. And out of that came the design review panels, which I think were very responsive and effective and used for, still being used. Fortunately, the resources aren't quite there for the architect. And I wanted the government architect to be outspoken. Most government architects around the country are very shy because they feel they owe allegiance to their government. I don't think that should be the case at all. And we wanted to create government architects with independence. And on planning changes, we got on with some minor changes, and we made some more responsiveness. We didn't get to change that line of responsibility like I hope we would. But if you're a developer, you think, I just don't want to have any local community involvement at all. That's a preference. That's crazy. If you're going to promote a development, sell a development, become part of a community, you need that local buy-in, and it's foolish not to go there because you just create enemies and what's the upside? So I would have relished the opportunity to be the planning minister myself, but Premier and Minister for the Arts, then I could be planning minister as well. So it's a portfolio of absolute fascination to me. And if you look at the legislative position, the planning minister has incredible authority and power, but they're actually reluctant to use it. If you know what you're doing, it could be very, very engaging.
So if you had the magic stick right now and you're the planning minister, what one thing would you change?
Well, I'd probably put those municipal strategic statements up there and limit trips to Decay and put all the responsibility and for left field proposals back at council level, and you create predictability. But I would also, if I was planning minister, I wouldn't be shy about looking at a proposal and identifying it, whether it's a good one or not, and saying, I'm not going to wear that. I'm not going to impose that on the community. Do better. But to be fair, most planning ministers aren't even that struggle to read a drawing, frankly, and they can take advice. But if you can't spot the flaws in the project within the first couple of minutes, you're going to be reluctant to do it. So, but equally, I'd be saying to people that is a sensational proposition. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, there seems to be this tension as well between the role of councillors and the role of council officers. And sometimes, I mean, I've had experience where councils are asking for things way over and above what's in the planning scheme, beyond what's reasonable. But in order to get their support, you have to concede.
Yeah, well, councillors aren't necessarily well equipped themselves, other than having a handle on local community field, because they're no better at reading drawings, reading outcomes, understanding the implications of a particular envelope. They see community activity, they see something that's large or different, and they'll be nervous. And so small things become important in the game of the system. Okay, give me 10 little things and I'll give up one big thing. And it's just a kind of childish negotiation disguised as a planning process, which I always find particularly disappointing. But, people of goodwill with good understanding can ensure good projects get the go-ahead. And people who do good projects, they should be getting the 5-star award from the local council and from the local community, and they should be recognised and rewarded as such, so that every time they come to a permit application, yep, these are the 5-star guys. We understand it. We have faith in them.
Yeah, it's a real challenge getting a permit these days. Just feels like it's getting more and more difficult, and with more and more reports and
slow is not good for anybody, in my view. And the cottage industries that are sprung up around planning permits are crazy. All the pre-planning work that has to go in, everybody gets paid, but nobody's responsible. And all of that contributes to this high cost of construction in this country. Start again. Highest cost buildings in the world, but not the best buildings in the world.
Something like 30 to 40% of that end cost consists of fees, taxes and charges levied by governments and other agencies along the way.
If you look at why we have high cost of construction, the industry is actually not very competitive. And people say, "Are you kidding me? We're constantly. No, everybody competes on the same inputs. We have monopoly suppliers, or effective monopoly suppliers in some areas. We don't have much international competition. There is a very heavy industrial overlay. And the procurement practices for government are almost childish. I mean, governments announce projects and the first thing they do is announce the price. and they have no idea what the price is going to be. And the industry says, well, that's become our bottom line benchmark, and now we work up from there. And so everybody assumes that when the government announces it's going to cost $100 million, that it'll probably cost 200. The industry knows that. Everybody knows it. It's just the worst procurement practice you can possibly advance. But that's what somehow or other we trained the media to demand. What's the final price before we even know what the project is? So you add it all up, in this country, there is no focus on construction cost. And this is the little tester for you. Just who cares? In the building development process, who is there who cares what it costs? In the construction industry, who cares what it costs? Building infrastructure, who cares what it costs? The only people who ever care are the payers. And in infrastructure, who are the payers? They're the water users, the road users, the power users, and they get the bill down the track. Nobody else is paying the bill, and no one's looking after their interests. In the domestic system, the residential system, the office system, who cares? Whatever it costs becomes the benchmark, and what we get to compensate if the prices get high. Two ingredients which the industry turns to better satisfy the market: size and quality. The quality comes down and the size comes down. And the classic for me was, before I left, I had somebody come to me in my office in Hawthorne and say, well, I just want to show you this proposal, high-rise residential in North Melbourne. There's going to be 1,000 apartments, and every one of them was 16 square metres. And it was a golden tower with magnificent perspectives in colour, and it was gleaming in the sunset. But every apartment's 16 square metres. And you think, okay. They got their permit, I think, but actually didn't proceed for other reasons. But that's the end point where size and quality no longer matter. It's just a marketing campaign. And that's, for me, a direct function of not having sorted out why everything's so expensive. And we don't sort it out because actually no one cares.
I hadn't actually ever considered that before. I think you're spot on. Certainly councils don't, with the things they keep flicking back over onto the developer to take care of, infrastructure fees and other civil works. It just gets pushed onto the developer.
There's a classic one, and I don't mean to single it out, but it's because it's sort of there. And we in our collective wisdom, we have a desal plant down at Wonthaggi, and it's on a particular model and funding arrangement which is questionable, but it's there. So let's just put aside all of those issues about the politics of desal and whether it worked and whether it has been a useful acquisition. But it was, for in its day, the most expensive desal plant anywhere in the world. And it's barely been used, but that's another point. So I asked myself, okay, well, who in that whole process had carriage of ensuring it wasn't the most expensive plant in the world? It didn't worry the builders, it didn't worry the finances, it didn't worry the banks, it didn't worry the planners, it didn't worry the government because it was off the books. You could go through every single entity involved in the development of that project, and none of them had carriage of the interests of the payers. And the payers were the water users of the future. And no one had line of responsibility for that. So whatever it cost, didn't matter. The more it cost, the more money people made. And there were wages on site there, which I won't go into because it sounds like fingering people, but they were staggering wages on site there. And every consultancy under the belt. It was the same disposition. They didn't care what it cost. We've got our desal plant, which we hardly ever used, if ever. And what did that project do? It became the benchmark of costs for all the future infrastructure projects. And you think, oh my God, how do you stop this? So what's the outcome of all this? I refer to what I call the revolution of the payers, because I think the payers are getting jack of all of this. They haven't quite put two and two together yet. They've certainly started to rail at the cost of gas and electricity and tolls and rates and fees and charges and all these things that the payers get hit with, but they can't actually put their finger on why it's so expensive. And we're all just encouraged to think, well, that's just what the cost is. And no one's actually chucking down the challenge. Okay, well, here's the objective. We want to halve the cost of this. What are you going to do? There is no mission like that. So beware the payers.
Yeah, I know that frustration as well from a development perspective, where you're looking at your feasibility and you're looking at all these line items and you think, God, they all add up. So then you go on the hunt to try and find some savings somewhere, and you might find that saving of whatever it might be, and then you get hit by some new charge that comes along.
You have to laugh on some of the big projects and the consortia come together and they go to tender, and the tender process is probably still the best process in my view. But they go to tender and they're all tendering on the same inputs. They're all using similar suppliers, similar contractors down at the lower level. And to win a job, what are they doing to win a job? Well, they're gaming the system. They're saying, well, I reckon I can game the variations better than the bloke down the road. And I'll punt on being able to game the variations. I'll be punting on cutting a fine line here or a fine line there. And I'm going to have a bit more availability than the bloke down the road in 6 months' time. And the one thing that's never contested is the core cost. It's everything else on the edges. That's usually lends itself to gaming the quality as well, which is unfortunate. And we've seen that in the cladding inquiry, and what a tragic and the classic story that was at the Grenfell Tower, whereas to save money, they changed the cladding system to a defective system.
Yeah, I look at that and go, how frustrating is that when, as you say, you have really high building costs and yet you end up with a building that is defective in a serious way.
And we've seen it in Sydney, in some of the towers in Sydney, and I know there's more to come probably in Victoria in that respect. But the industry has created the role of value manager on site. And it's the value manager's job to game the system. Okay, I can understand why they're there, but it doesn't lend itself to outcomes of trust and confidence again.
Yeah, as a buyer, you're buying into one of those apartments in good faith, and then you end up with a lemon, and you're looking around going, I didn't do anything wrong, and they didn't, and they're just stuck.
Yeah. And I'm old enough to remember old building regulations and old planning schemes where you had to have natural ventilation, cross ventilation was an asset, and you had to have open space to certain levels, and minimums were frowned upon rather than became the benchmarks. But if you're at 6'7", you walk into an apartment these days, you've got to watch your head so you don't get hit by the ceiling fan. That's the only ventilation going around.
That's you, for listeners out there who don't know that Ted's quite tall.
Starting to shrink, I'm afraid.
Well, Tell me, what's one thing or something that you miss about politics?
I relished being there in the middle. I relished being able to challenge on the detail. So I relished all of that. And I don't begrudge anybody else in government having to deal with some of the decision making, because if you're not comfortable around a development project, if you're not comfortable reading plans and drawings and scale and all that sort of thing, it'll be hard. So your question, do I miss? Yeah, I miss that. I miss all the hoo-ha that goes with it.
What did you learn about yourself when you were Premier, Ted?
I learnt that it's smart not to, that I'd done the right thing by not being a drinker. I'd done the right thing by not being a smoker. And I've done the right thing by being constantly fit or trying to be fit. And I think it's important to get a sense of your own capacity and confidence. And I'm always open to the proposition that I might be wrong, and I always kind of start with that proposition. But I'm also open to the proposition, well, hang on, I may well be right. Let's test it.
And speaking of staying healthy, I understand you are an iceberg swimmer. You like the cold water. Is that still the case? You're still swimming?
I'm a Brighton iceberger, and I've been doing that for 20 years. Swim all year round, just with a pair of Speedos on. Nothing like a couple of Ks in 9-degree water in the middle of July in a pair of Speedos. It's, as I say to people, very difficult to focus on anything else other than what your immediate surrounds are and surviving. That's a pretty healthy thing to do.
All right, let's switch gears now, Ted, if we can. I'd like to do a couple of quick fire style Q&A questions, if you're comfortable with that.
Yep, sure.
All right. True or false? Are you the chieftain of the Victorian Highland Pipe Band Association?
Yes, I am.
All right, very good. Another true or false question. You wanted to develop your own line of Speedos for cold water swimming.
Not sure where you got that one from, but it's entirely possible we might have discussed that with somebody along the way who might have leaked it on me, but we're still wearing Speedos, most of us. And
you need to come up with some special inbuilt heating unit, I suspect.
Yeah, there's no way around it. When the water's under 10 degrees, you're conscious of life expectancy, and by the time you get to a shower, the whole body is tomato red. It's torture.
All right, so we'll take that as a true then.
It's the swimmer's equivalent of the planning scheme. It's self-inflicted torture.
Yeah. Favourite architect?
In contemporary terms,
you choose.
Well, my favourite building is the old Manchester Unity, and Marks Bar and all that lot, and that's my favourite Melbourne building. Contemporary architects, I'll stay away from the Melbourne ones just because I'll get into trouble if I do that. But I follow fairly carefully Tom Bloxham and Urban Splash, who was out at Melbourne University a few years ago, and really interesting medium density housing, social housing they do in the world.
I was going to ask you about
UK and around the world.
I was going to ask you about your favourite public building, but you've answered that. What about your least favoured public building?
Well, probably my least favourite building is between the MCG and the Tennis Centre. It's the offices of Tennis Australia and the Australian Open. And to this day, I'm not sure how it got there.
Oh, that big building next to the train line, or the mid-rise building.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it does stick out a bit. Okay, if you could have dinner with any person, alive or dead, who would it be and why?
Wow, there's a good question. Alive or dead? Let's go with the alives. Right now, I'd probably say, hey, just wouldn't mind sitting down with Tim Minchin. Fabulous lyricist, got a lovely touch, good communicator. You might not feel the same way about me, but he's a super impressive individual. And on the dead, Jim Kelly, Donald O'Connor, something like that.
And who are they?
Yep. Dancers, singers, and of course, be hard to go past Elvis, wouldn't it?
Well, we know where your interests lie now, somewhere in the musical realm.
Some of it, yep.
Okay. What's a question you wished you'd been asked in public life but you never were?
Well, I'll give you another little tease. The night I stepped down as being Premier, I did a press conference that evening, and we finished that press conference, and I walked away with my media advisor. I said to my media advisor, you know what? Nobody asked me why. So there you go. How about that?
Would you like the opportunity now to answer that? Do you want me to ask you?
No. It's they should have asked me at the time, and eventually I'll have something to say about that. But
okay, well, we'll keep that one on tenterhooks. All right, let's head down the finishing straight now, Ted. I'm very grateful to you for your time so far. But what's your one tip for developers out there that might be looking to take their business to the next level?
Raise your sights. Don't benchmark. Raise your sights. Quality. And it goes without saying, if you're going to do that, keep your community on board.
Well, if people want to find out more about you or get in touch, what's the best platform or the best way? Where should they go looking?
The best way is I've got an office in the old Treasury building with other former premiers, and work out of there. But probably the best way is through email, formerpremier46@gmail.com.
I think you're active on Twitter as well, aren't you?
Active on Twitter, yeah. You can direct message me on Twitter. Not that many people do, but I'm just there on my own name on Twitter. And I enjoy the engagement on Twitter, particularly with things that are happening in architecture, planning, development in the UK and in Ireland in particular, because there's a lot of common ground we share. A lot of issues are common. So I'm there.
Fantastic. And one last question. Have you been doing something different or new or unusual in the last couple of weeks and months, apart from being stuck at home? Is there anything you've been doing differently or you could share?
We're certainly spending more time at home, and I'm sure it looks like that's going to go on for a fair while yet. It's interesting to contemplate how we emerge from this. I think there are probably three phases. We look broadly. Some of our key strengths have been heavily eroded with the events, hospitality, sports, culture, immigration, international education. A variety of our strengths have really been smacked. And that's going to change the world's interest in us. It's going to change Australia's interest in us. So three phases. I think we're going to have to recover our own local economies first, and that might take 1 or 2 years. And then I think we're going to have to recover our position in Australia, which might take 3 or 5 years, and then recover our position internationally, and that might take longer still. And the notion of just jumping on a plane and flying here or there will be problematic for some time. And if you look at the other way around, what's the world's interest in us? Do they need us, or do we need the world more than them? My own view is we're going to have to reach out big time, particularly to India and to Southeast Asia. and the sooner we do that, the better. But it's going to be harder to persuade the world to give us the benefit of the doubt where they're looking to invest, and that's going to require a pretty dedicated effort to restore ourselves. And in that respect, going back to where we started, if we think we can still be the centre of the highest construction cost in the world and attract international attention as well, I think we're kidding ourselves.
Well, one thing it has certainly shone a light on is the importance of good design. And if everyone's spending all this time inside and in their homes, it's going to really magnify whether they like the space they're in.
Yep, and I think hopefully we'll be a bit more judgmental about the product that's on offer. And I hope that developers see their way through that. We may find that the short term that it's going to be a bit harder to get projects up financially. There'll be less disposable income, presumably. I imagine there'll be less demand for housing with less immigration, so there'll be likely more sellers, fewer buyers, lower prices for existing product. And with existing product, new product will have to be better and cheaper, and that will hopefully force some good outcomes. It certainly can't be worse than cheaper. That would be a mistake. But I think we have to review that balance of the planning system so that community gets a better understanding of what they're getting into. But it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, well, let's hope we can get back to focusing on all those things in the coming months and years, which we're going to need to do to get this place back on track.
Good on you, Josh. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Ted. It's been awesome having you on the Property Developer Podcast. Really appreciate your insights on what it's like to run government, shape policy, and also your thoughts on architecture and how design influences people in their lives. So really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
No worries. Thanks, Justin. Cheers. Bye.
Okay, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I found it fascinating to hear some of Ted's thoughts on how the planning process is letting many people down, including developers, and what can be done to fix it. Sadly, I think many governments are too afraid of upsetting people to make any meaningful changes to the system. Anyway, here are 3 things I took away from the discussion. 1. Raise your sights. Ted's key piece of advice for property developers looking to take their business to the next level is to raise their sights. So how can you improve your current or next project? Can you up the quality of the design? Improve communal spaces? Sharpen the finish? There's so many little things that you can look at to improve your overall project. 2. Keep your local community on board. For some people, community engagement can be a challenge, and I think that relates to people saying no or rejecting your proposal. As Ted says, these people are often your potential buyers and may actually have some good ideas on how aspects of the project could be improved. Now, I've certainly experienced anger and frustration from locals on new projects, so I understand how challenging it can be at times. But I think listening and being open to community feedback is a good skill to have. 3. Understand your local market. This was an interesting point that Ted made about delivering product that the local market needs or wants, versus what you can build based on the planning scheme in the area. I think there will always be some tension between residents who live in an area in a certain type of dwelling, say larger blocks with single houses on them, and developers who may want to add a different type of stock in the area and maybe attract a slightly different group into that area. I think listening to the concerns of locals and genuinely seeing what can be done to alleviate those concerns is a good first step to overcoming resistance. And there will always be a group of people who simply don't want any change at all. It all comes back to being certain about what you are offering is in demand for the area. Alright, if you enjoyed that chat with Ted Baillieu, you might like to go back and listen to episode 40, where I spoke with planning expert David Crowder about how you can give yourself the very best chance of obtaining a good planning outcome. David had this piece of advice for submitting the best initial application that you can.
I would always say that you're better off having a complete planning application and waiting that extra 1 or 2 weeks to get everything together and lodged as a complete application. I think it goes to your credibility, but it also assists the planner who, remembering they've got 30 other files to pile through, if everything's there, instead of things coming in bit by bit, it makes their job a bit easier as well.
There is a lot of gold in that chat, so be sure to revisit episode 40 with David Crowder. Okay, don't forget to email me if you want to learn more about the Property Developing Mentoring Program. Email justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com and I'll send you some further info. You can always find me on Insta and Facebook for my latest project updates, videos and other fun stuff. Just search for Property Developer Podcast. And feel free to drop a comment on iTunes if you are enjoying a show. So, until next time, may all your planning applications be speedy and positive.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.